I would like now to invite all the representatives of the breakout sessions. So I have here Tim Dixon, who is General Manager of the IEA Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We also have Nora Hammer, who is the Senior International Carbon Capture Policy Lead. I have Stefano Miriello, who is the Head of EU External Affairs within the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. I have Christina Stabe, who is our Global Finance Impact Lead within the Global CSC Institute. And finally, I have Jonathan Osmond, who is Senior Consultant within DNV specialized on CO2 storage. And I'm also going to welcome my colleague Dominique Russell, who is Senior Business Development Lead within Europe. I think he will join in a minute. So I will first begin with you, Tim. So you were co-facilitating together with Nora the session on international policy, the Carbon Management Challenge. So today was a very European discussion, so I was wondering if the challenges we've been facing here in Europe are also a matter of concerns at the international level, if you see some opportunities in Europe you don't see in other regions, etc. So please, if you could tell us more on your breakout session.
Okay, thank you very much. So what we're going to do is give a readout from that panel session, and Nora is going to go first because we realise that there's a low level of awareness on the Carbon Management Challenge. So Nora, over to you.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we'll be presenting on the Carbon Management Challenge. So for those who are not aware, the Carbon Management Challenge, known as the CMC, is a global call to action aimed at driving the adoption of carbon management technologies, advancing a pipeline of projects by 2030 that, when fully operational, will reach a gigaton of CO2 captured and stored annually. It's the first sort of the value add of the Carbon Management Challenge is that it's the first high-level and visible global carbon management agreement aligned with the Paris Agreement. And year on year, we have annual ministerial roundtables with 20-plus ministers around the table at the COP. So it creates that high-level visibility. And we look to build on existing strong collaboration through existing government initiatives, such as MICDR and CMC, as well as others. And a big part of the Carbon Management Challenge is engaging with stakeholders and promoting collaboration and knowledge sharing between governments, as well as industry, NGOs, private sector, academia, etc. So next slide, please. So just a quick one, just to show the wide, the diversity of the Carbon Management Challenge. That is one of our strengths. So, we have, countries in the Americas, Southeast Asia, a lot of in Africa as well, Europe. So just really that wide range, and each country has a different interest when it comes to carbon management. So, for example, you'll have a country like Kenya that is most interested in just CDR, so direct air capture. Because of the basalts there, that creates an opportunity for them. Whereas you have other countries that are more interested in point source capture. So from the same continent, Nigeria would have a different approach to carbon management. So it really is an umbrella to bring everyone together to really accelerate towards that gigaton goal. So next slide, please. Now I'll move on to Tim. So as part of what we were the session itself was a stakeholder engagement session. So this is one of the first steps towards a stakeholder engagement mechanism that the CMC is launching within the month. So it's currently in review by countries. So that review ends on the 27th of March. And after that, we're hoping to welcome stakeholders into the challenge on the different work streams of the challenge. So we have 3 different work streams the countries defined, one being developing country project finance, 2 being project deployment and tracking, and 3 being strategic communications and engagement. All this information is on the website, but I'll move to Tim to give us the stakeholders' view of what happened today.
Okay, thank you, Nora. Thanks for the invitation. So IEA-GHG, we're an example of a stakeholder, and this was about launching the stakeholder engagement mechanism of the Carbon Management Challenge. And in the room, we had about 16 people, half from industry, the rest from academia, NGOs, private sector, and finance. And it was a request to the room, to the stakeholders, what do stakeholders want from the Carbon Management Challenge and this mechanism. So the first was that there was a low level of awareness of the carbon management challenge, so there needs to be more promotion about the CMC. And yes, the CMC is 22 different countries plus the European Commission, so it's a government-to-government entity at the moment. But this can do things, and one of the things it can do is sharing risk, knowledge and experience. And as we heard in a way from this morning's sessions, the discussion and understanding of risk between the finance world and the technical world is very important. That's more developed in some countries, like the UK and the US, but not in others. So that sharing of knowledge is very important. Basic questions like what's the scope of the carbon management challenge in terms of technologies? Does it go as far as biochar, for example? We understand it's engineered CDR and CCUS, so that includes BECCS and DAC, but defining that scope hasn't been done by the country members yet. The workstream 2, which is tracking project activities and also sharing knowledge between the countries, acting as a one-stop shop for access to policy from different countries, policy sharing, but also the regulation sharing between countries. So that would be another suggestion. And then also, interestingly, because this is an independent sort of body of 22 countries plus the EC, an independent assessment of the policy effectiveness and the success of policies in different countries. The encouragement of common standards in CCUS project, carbon management project development as well was a point. And of course, policy certainty in the long term, with the investments in these projects being 15, 20, 30 years, policy certainty in the long term was a strong request. And the work stream 1, as Nora mentioned, is about finance for developing countries specifically, and there was general support for that in the room, and encouraging the multilateral banks and the climate finance, like the Green Climate Fund, to put more money in, because they don't put much in at the moment on this technology for developing countries. And in conclusion, I think Nora concluded nicely by saying, to achieve the gigaton goal, we need to all work together. And so that's the request from the Carbon Management Challenge to the stakeholders, is to get engaged and get involved in the work streams and all work together.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. Perhaps, Nora, you would like to react?
Yes, just the next slide, please. Thank you, Tim, for that. And also just to mention, in our session, the government of the United Kingdom was with us. They are the regional lead for Europe for the next year. So that's the governance structure of the Carbon Management Challenge is on the website, where you can learn more about how decisions are made and how the 22 countries plus the European Commission move forward as one. So the website is carbonmanagementchallenge.org. You can go on there and click on resources, and you can see videos of our ministerials, as well as press releases and other information. And then the LinkedIn page as well, follow along for updates and join the conversation. That's it from us. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tim, Nora. Thank you, Tim, for staying with us. We know your time is very precious. So we wish you the best of luck with the launch of your stakeholder engagement mechanism, I think in a month, if I remember correctly. Now, moving to Stefano, you also took international issues very seriously. I think your organization released a report on cross-border transport CO2, I think, was it back to December 2024? So I was wondering if you also highlighted a lot of international consideration today, or if the debate was more on whether to have a light-touch CO2 transport regulation or a bit more government supervision in Europe. So please tell us more international and also domestic issues within the EU.
So yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to the Global CCS Institute for having us today here. Just maybe a word on the CCSA for those that are not familiar. We are the European Trade Association representing companies, 135 across the full CCS value chain. And transport is a key topic nowadays, because we know that the Commission, or at least we hope that the Commission will start working on this as soon as possible in the next weeks on a regulatory package that will come on CO2 transport. That entails, of course, dimension within the European Economic Area. But during this workshop with almost a full room in here, we discussed also the international dimension. So we have, as you can see on the slide, tackled 4 areas. So unlocking CO2 transport access, the standards and the role of standardization bodies, which is going to be key, the cross-border cooperation, and the funding strategies to make sure that investments get through the line. So just to share a few points of what we've discussed and let's say commonly and shortly agreed on these points. So on unlocking CO2 transport access is pretty key to look at not over-regulating these markets, or learning by the market. That's very important. Look at complementarity of transport means and all the modes. So pipeline, non-pipeline, so shipping, rail, and trucks, how they can interact, and how to get access to small emitters and landlocked countries with different combination of transport modes. And we have looked into this first part of the session at how the shipping industry can be ready to invest and how funding schemes should look at the value chain to support return on investment of all the different transport modes included. On standards, very briefly, the important role of standardization bodies has been highlighted. And in that case, looking at how minimum set of standards is required and how to learn by the market when setting standards that don't have to limit investments. On funding, there was a huge mention of mix of national funds, so investments schemes such as the SD++ in the Netherlands or others, and the European funding, so Connecting Europe facility for investment cross-border, or projects, for example, under the IPSIS and others. And of course, as I mentioned, how to fund the full value chain in this case and include shipping to the dimension as well. And on the cross-border part, we have discussed the challenges that we have nowadays for cooperation outside the EEA. So we have highlighted the cooperation in the Mediterranean, so how could that potentially be brought forward in the future. There was a mention of MOUs between Greece and Egypt lately. And we have also discussed cooperation, for example, with the UK and North Sea. You were mentioning our report. I have a copy here. I've done this many times, so people have already seen this, but it's accelerating a Europe-wide CO2 storage market. We have published this in December here in Brussels in European Parliament. And basically here we have done the exercise of looking at how the inclusion of the UK in a Europe-wide CO2 storage market could support European and EU industrial emitters. The main finding is that if you include the UK in this market, prices for EU emitters will drop down by 28% on average for transport and storage, 16 euros per ton, counting in 2.6 billion of savings by 2040. And this is for, of course, the whole Europe as a continent, so EEA, including the UK. I think these are the main elements to flag for what we have discussed. An interesting session. Of course, we haven't solved the issue of CO2 transport in Europe in 1 hour, but a lot of food for thought, and hope was helpful for all participants and for all of us you listening here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefano and Bruno, for these efforts. So we do have some basic regulatory principles of CO2 pipelines, not on CO2 transport. So we are very much welcoming the future regulatory framework by the European Commission on CO2 transport. So Stefano, you mentioned funding, and now I would like to move to my colleague, Christina. So we are all aware of the Clean Industrial Deal that was released about months ago. And I think financing was one of the main pillars of this industrial twist that the European Commission is trying to give to the European Green Deal. So your session was specifically on CCS financing. Perhaps can you tell us more? Did you mention all these new principles that the European Commission put forward?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mathilde. So basically, the purpose of our session was to bring together proponents from different industries and parts of the value chain to discuss their perspectives about the status of and economic challenges to deployment, and to engage the audience on these topics. So it was about financing, but it was also about a lot of peripheral topics that ultimately lead to financing. So I apologize, I didn't have time to put our bullets on the slides, so I will very concisely read the input from our breakout session, but I wanted to let folks know that our co-leads were from Equinor, ArcelorMittal, and Heidelberg Materials, and we also had participation from the audience as well. So what I share is kind of a high-level summary of those collective thoughts. So again, let me just preface this by saying that some of this won't be new news to a lot of you that have been in the CCS space for a while, but I think it has value as a snapshot of the thoughts of the folks in the room today. And so we say, okay, are we still here? Yeah, we kind of are still here. But the first question, what approaches can help optimize CCS project and value chain costs? And one thing that really emerged in our panel this morning as well was, where possible, bringing the value chain forward at the same time from project development to FID can really help to optimize costs. But beyond that, there was mention of basic conditions for optimization, even before you get to optimizing, having an effective regulatory framework, including trade defense, competitive energy prices, and eliminating the EU ETS uncertainty. Of course, supporting economies of scale when available can help make costs more efficient, make sure you have sufficient volume commitments in place. Kind of a new topic, but a continuing one of discussion is standardizing CO2 streams for capture and transportation, finding that balance between CO2 specifications to optimize costs while ensuring pipeline integrity. Adequately supporting public acceptance as part of project deployment to make deployment more effective. And then finally, working with public authorities to help them recognize the urgency around decarbonization projects. So, not pure finance topics, but certainly all things that could ultimately affect the cost of your project and of your value chain. Our next question was, what are challenges with risk allocation along the CCS value chain and potential solutions? Again, the EU ETS price came up as being insufficient to incentivize deployment without government support, the feeling that projects won't move forward based on where the price is now. The challenge of managing interdependencies was brought up, and therefore the need to understand, collaborate, and share risks along the value chain, and again, align timelines within the value chain. Ensuring there's a strong volume commitment to lower transportation and storage costs, having clear definitions of liability along the value chain, who's liable for various events when they happen. And then another big one was real versus perceived technology risks by stakeholders, including banks and insurers, because poor understanding of the true technology risk can result in a lack of financial support or more expensive capital for your project. And finally, we discussed that government has a role to absorb risk from early movers in the sector, and then, but that can be reduced, of course, as more CCS deployments move forward. So what is missing from current policy and incentive landscape to support sufficient business models for deployment was our next question, and this could have been a conference in itself, I think, but the big things that we landed on were simplifying access to public funding for both innovation and project development. We discussed alignment of funding criteria across different incentives and designing the incentives so that they can be stacked when appropriate. Finding a way to provide industry-specific incentives for hard-to-abate industries, stronger EU support for developing cross-border networks and clusters, having visible long-term commitments in the policy frameworks, coverage for project and project risks, and as coming from the Clean Industrial Deal, EU-wide CCFDs to enable cross-boundary transportation and storage products, getting countries to focus more on than just their country-specific priorities and think EU-wide. And then finally, we really briefly touched on lead markets for low-carbon products and how that can help drive demand. And we talked about how public procurement can have a significant role in driving demand for low-carbon products. Again, the role of the government there. Mentioned that there's really a limited willingness to pay a premium for low-carbon products at the moment. And so one suggestion was pre-funding market development for these products to bring the demand forward, kind of similar to what we're doing with carbon dioxide removal. And then finally, we briefly discussed how emerging CCU applications can create demand for captured CO2.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Christina. So now moving to, just be conscious of time, to my colleague Jonathan, who is senior consultant within DNV on CO2 storage. So we know that the EU CCS directive is storage neutral, so it's up to member states to decide whether they are going to allow CO2 storage onshore, offshore, both, or no CO2 storage at all. So I was just curious, what are the countries considering this option? And can you tell us more perhaps on what you need to consider when you decide to develop an onshore CO2 storage site?
Thank you. Yes, so during our session, that came up quite a bit. Of course, there's a lot of attention currently on Denmark, as there's been a rapid increase in licensing and attention related to onshore storage there. They're not the only ones, but momentum is maybe slightly less mature or in a different phase in other countries. So, for instance, in Eastern Europe, in Romania or Poland, for instance. But some of the challenges are, at least from a technical standpoint, not necessarily that much different, at least when it comes to the subsurface related aspects of the storage. But when we start to talk about things like public acceptance or regulatory frameworks and maturity from that perspective, that's when we start to talk about a little bit more site-specific kind of challenges and also benefits. Of course, also one of the things that we discussed during the session was access to CO2 source or emitters and the transportation of that. We also discussed a few other points. Actually mainly related to, there was a few discussion points about capacity onshore. And we had some discussion about whether capacity and sort of reserves, how that really will match up in the end. But overall perspective is that CO2 storage capacity onshore can be quite significant and will provide tremendous value over the CCS industry in Europe, but it'll be site-specific. In Denmark, a lot of those resources have been mapped by the state, but also are being further mapped by the current license holders and future license holders. And that's probably to be expected in other places, and has been done in other places by the member states themselves or their agencies. But overall, aside from a lot of the attention on, or at least we can revisit the aspect of gaining public acceptance and stakeholder acceptance on CO2 storage onshore, which is one of the primary challenges. We see that there's actually, this will be site-specific, but in the long run, this is something that has to be focused on and should be prioritized over many other aspects. I mean, of course, there's financial aspects and regulatory aspects, but it seems like, at least in the room, there was a lot of discussion and attention brought into how do we communicate in the best way, in the right locations, to store, to be able to store, basically. So I think those are the main challenges that we got to.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan. Hopefully the CO2 storage atlas that the European Commission is going to implement will also help us to map out these options in Europe. So now moving to the final facilitator, Dominic Russell. So it's been a bit of a tradition to have a session on carbon dioxide removals within the Institute. I think it's been 3 years that we are doing such a breakout session, but this year in particular, there were a lot of appetite from the policy side on CDRs. I think we were all welcoming the adoption of this EU CRCF, and hopefully soon the methodologies. We also had countries subsidizing CDRs, BECS, in particular Sweden, Denmark. And I think 2 days ago I read that the Dutch government published a national roadmap on CDRs. So I was wondering, Dominic, did you have the same appetite in your breakout session?
Appetite, perhaps, yeah. I think that's reflected mostly by the attendance and maybe the vigor with which people were commenting and providing inputs. But we started off actually in North America because unconventionally compared to some of the others, I had one of our members, Elimini, make a presentation on, because they're quite new. And I think it's nice to have fresh eyes on this topic as well. And although they stem from Drax, Elimini gave us a good presentation on their own story and where they are now. And interestingly, they had initially sort of strategically positioned themselves in North America, but with recent changes in the administration, they've sort of started to pivot away from that because they sense perhaps that there's a lack of sort of stimulus for demand in the VCM market, and potentially also, there's uncertainty around 45Q potentially. So we shifted back to Europe, obviously with the positive news that you've announced. It's not a coincidence that perhaps that they're looking at that space as well. But a lot of our conversation sort of focused around the CRCF, the also potential relationship between sort of global north and global south in the VCM market, and also specifically with the CRCF and the EU ETS integration. And again, there's uncertainty there as well. And inevitably, of course, there was some discussion around MRV about also how do we sort of quantify the removals credits. Do we look at sort of net, gross, net being obviously considering the upstream and downstream emissions, and what I'd like to probably term as some kind of fungibility between these compliance sort of allowances and removals. So to that end there, I'd say in summary that there's fragmentation and there is uncertainty even within Europe as well. I think someone said that the European Commission had maybe thrown the sort of CDR under the bus a bit, but I think it's just because of a bit of frustration. So the good news is, I suppose, there's an upcoming consultation with the CRCF, and I think that's a great opportunity for us to potentially collaborate and provide some very valuable inputs to next steps. And so then we can get more clarity and things can go ahead. Just one interesting anecdote from that workshop as well was, I think it was James in Hungary who said that there is free green CO2 in Hungary, but no one wants it, even for usage. So that's also indicative of that fragmentation again, because I think Shana from Genesis afterwards said, well, actually, after today's meeting, I think you're going to have an inbox full of requests for your CO2. So there you have it, Mathilde.
Thank you very much, Dom. And perhaps if I can be a bit more optimistic than you've been, in the Clean Industrial Deal, there was a repetition that the European Commission was going to look at the integration of CDR within the EU ETS. So hopefully it will happen very soon. Let's see what the coming months
yeah,
tell us.
we touched on that as well, but I think it's just a question of like how much of this is going to be compliance as well for the emitters, and how much of the CDR will they need to have. And then there's also the obvious question of scale and where that's going to come from, et cetera. But yeah, TBC. And of course, I'm not pessimistic, I'm just the messenger.
And I think other jurisdictions outside Europe are also considering this potential integration, such as the United Kingdom. And I think in New Zealand, Australia, they're also taking into consideration forestry activities within their emission trading scheme. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, our co-facilitators, also our partner organizations, our presenters today. I think it's a lot of new considerations that we'll take forward to next year's forum. So thank you very much. And having said that, I would like to hand over the floor to our Chief Impact Officer, Mrs. Guloren Turan. Thank you very much.